On October 27, 1962, the world teetered on the brink of oblivion. In a span of just 10 hours, from 11:15 a.m. to 9:15 p.m. Washington time, two seemingly unconnected events on opposite sides of the globe brought humanity closer to extinction than ever before. What really happened during those 10 harrowing hours? How did the world come so close to its end, not once, but twice? And more importantly, how did we survive? This is the story of a day when fate held its breath, and death nearly claimed us all. At 12:15 a.m. Tokyo time, the calm of the night was shattered at a secret U.S. military base in Okinawa. A routine directive came through, confirming that all combat teams had entered DEFCON 2, the second highest level of alert. In this state, everything was ready. Within 2 minutes, the base could escalate to DEFCON 1, the moment where orders to launch would be issued. Once in DEFCON 1, missile crews were required to launch all nuclear weapons within a single minute after receiving the final command. This base housed 8 teams, each responsible for 4 missiles. Every one of those missiles was armed with a nuclear warhead, each 70 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Their range? A staggering 2,200 kilometers, enough to strike targets across Vietnam, China, North Korea, and the Soviet Union. Routine directives usually ended with 2 coded messages. The first updated weather conditions or synchronized mission times. The second typically included a simple sign-off, something like complete, thank you, or goodbye. But not this time. The second message wasn't an ending, it was a code. Private John Bodner, on duty at the time, nervously flipped through his code book. His hands shook as he cross-referenced the string of numbers and letters. Moments later, his worst fears were confirmed. The command was to launch the missiles immediately. John's team was led by Launch Officer William Bassett. Bassett opened the sealed launch pouch, retrieving both the coded authentication and an envelope containing the launch keys and designated targets. Protocol required one final message to verify the launch. If that message matched the code in the pouch, Bassett would have to open the envelope and proceed with the attack. The confirmation message soon came in. It matched. Tension in the room was suffocating. Bassett hesitated. Instead of rushing to act, he called the other 6 missile teams across the base. To his shock, every single team had received the exact same order. Each was opening their own envelopes and preparing for launch. But something didn't sit right with Bassett. He raised a critical question. Why hadn't they first received an order to elevate to DEFCON 1? Another launch officer dismissed his doubts. It's possible enemy missiles are already in the air. The higher-ups might have skipped that step in the urgency. We're out of time. Just follow the order. As per protocol, Bassett read aloud the 4 designated targets from his envelope. The room froze. Of the 4 targets, 3 weren't even in the Soviet Union. Moments later, another team reported the same anomaly. 2 of our targets aren't in the USSR either. Why are we being told to strike non-combatant nations? Bassett made a bold decision. Ignoring the mounting pressure, he contacted the Central Command Operations. The last directive came through garbled, he said, his voice calm but firm. Resend the full codes for verification. He was hoping someone higher up would realize the mistake and cancel the order. But the retransmitted directive was identical to the first. Launch the missiles. As tensions flared, one of the crews, whose targets were all within Soviet territory, insisted the order was valid and prepared to execute it. Bassett immediately ordered 2 armed soldiers to stand by. If they try to launch, he commanded, shoot them. We're not firing without a verbal order from a higher authority or confirmation of DEFCON 1. Then Bassett did the unthinkable. He broke protocol and called his superior officer directly. His voice left no room for negotiation. You have 2 options, he said. Either escalate us to DEFCON 1 or cancel the launch order immediately. Minutes later, a new directive came through over the radio. Launch canceled. Stand down. What had nearly become a nuclear apocalypse turned out to be nothing more than a disastrous miscommunication, an unimaginable blunder. The clock read 12:45 a.m. Humanity had just narrowly avoided its first brush with death that day, and the night was far from over. 2 hours and 18 minutes later, at precisely 2:03 p.m. Washington time, the world's heartbeat quickened. The Cuban government announced it had shot down an American U-2 spy plane and boldly declared its readiness for a preemptive strike against the United States. By 4 p.m., U.S. officials were making their final preparations for war. Inside the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stared at the clock, a somber question haunting his mind. Will I live to see the sun rise tomorrow? This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when humanity teetered on the edge of annihilation. It all began with a chess move in 1961. The United States had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey, placing Moscow and other key Soviet cities within striking distance. Unwilling to stand by, the Soviet Union retaliated with a move of its own, the secret deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. With these missiles in place, Washington, New York, and every major American city would be within Soviet range. On October 14, 1962, U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviet missiles in Cuba. The response was immediate. American forces encircled Cuba by land, sea, and air. But the Soviets didn't flinch. They announced that any vessel flying the Soviet flag would ignore U.S. threats and continue to Cuba. If an American warship attacked a Soviet vessel, retaliation would be swift and absolute. Tensions spiraled out of control. On October 27, 1962, the day known as Black Saturday, Cuba escalated the crisis further. After shooting down the U-2 spy plane, Cuban officials warned they might strike first, aiming to cripple the United States before it could respond. The world held its breath. The clock ticked mercilessly forward. Then, at 4:59 p.m., events took a terrifying turn. In the waters off Cuba, a U.S. Navy destroyer dropped depth charges into the ocean. And its target? A Soviet submarine hiding in the depths. For over a week, the Americans had been shadowing this submarine, identified as B-59, as it maneuvered beneath the surface. Now, surrounded by 12 American destroyers, the Soviet crew found themselves cornered. Conditions aboard the B-59 were harrowing. The submarine had been submerged for days. Its air conditioning had failed, leaving temperatures inside soaring to 50 degrees Celsius. Oxygen levels were dropping. Each crew member was rationed just 1 glass of water per day. They were running out of time and choices. 3 paths lay before them. 1. Remain submerged, risking suffocation and death, but refusing to surrender their Soviet honor. 2. Surface and surrender, a move that would disgrace their nation. 3. Fire a torpedo to sink the American destroyers above, a bold act of war that would plunge the world into nuclear conflict. Each option carried unthinkable consequences. The crew's decision in the next moments would determine not just their fates, but the fate of the entire planet. At 5:29 p.m., another round of depth charges rained down near the Soviet submarine B-59. This time, the explosions were far more powerful. Inside the submarine, the crew could feel the pressure mounting, the hull groaned, on the verge of rupture. For Captain Valentin Savitsky, the message was clear. The Americans were no longer toying with them. He reasoned that during the week they had been submerged, cut off from all communication with Moscow, war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union must have already begun. Their mission to support the conflict was now clear. Surrender was unthinkable. Waiting would mean certain death. There was only one option left. Fire the torpedo. Start the war. The submarine's political officer agreed with Savitsky's conclusion. The crew sprang into action, brimming with adrenaline. They prepared the torpedo tube, awaiting the captain's command to fire. But then, a voice cut through the tension. "I don't agree with firing the torpedo." All eyes turned to the man who had spoken, Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine's second-in-command. What no one else on board knew was that this wasn't just any torpedo. Arkhipov held a secret. The torpedo was armed with a nuclear warhead. If they launched it, the resulting explosion would devastate the U.S. fleet above them and ignite a full-scale nuclear war between the superpowers. The world outside would plunge into chaos. At 5:58 p.m., the Americans dropped yet another round of depth charges. The blasts shook the submarine violently. Above them, the U.S. Navy still had no idea that the submarine they were attacking carried a nuclear payload. Savitsky was determined. He argued that the Americans' escalating aggression proved the war had already begun. The torpedo had to be launched now, but Arkhipov stood firm. He argued there was no definitive proof that hostilities had started. The Americans weren't targeting the submarine as an act of war, but rather to force them to surface. "If you fire, the world as we know it ends," he warned. What happened over the next 3 hours remains shrouded in mystery. Soviet archives have yet to reveal the full story. What we do know is this. At 9:15 p.m., B-59 surfaced. In the dark waters of the Caribbean, the submarine signaled its surrender. Captain Savitsky ordered no retaliation. Arkipov's gamble paid off. The war hadn't begun. The Americans didn't board the submarine. They didn't search for secrets. They simply let the B-59 slip away, fading into the night. It was a day like no other. Just 10 hours earlier, an American officer named William Bassett had disobeyed orders to prevent the launch of nuclear missiles. Now, it was a Soviet officer named Vasily Arkhipov who stopped a nuclear torpedo from being fired. Both men, oceans apart, had made decisions that saved humanity. But the story wasn't over. The next day, October 28th, the unthinkable happened. In a stunning move, the United States suddenly announced it would withdraw its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared it would remove its missiles from Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended just as suddenly as it began. The two superpowers extended their hands in a fragile peace. What caused this abrupt resolution? Historians believe the answer lies in a clandestine meeting on the night of October 27th. At 7:45 p.m., a secret negotiation took place between Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and President John F. Kennedy. What exactly was said during their half-hour conversation remains a mystery. But somehow, they accomplished in 30 minutes what years of Cold War diplomacy had failed to achieve. And just like that, the world stepped back from the brink. History might call it luck, fate, or the triumph of reason. But in truth, the world owes its survival to a handful of individuals, men like Bassett and Arkhipov, who stood up to the impossible and chose to save, rather than destroy, humanity. In May 2015, an elderly American veteran wept as he recounted an untold story from 1962, a tale that had remained classified for over half a century. The man was John Bordner, a soldier stationed on Okinawa during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That night, he stood in the same room as William Bassett, the man who defied orders to prevent a nuclear launch. But by the time John finally shared his story, Bassett had been dead for 4 years. John Bordner vividly remembered those tense 30 minutes, a moment when the world balanced on a knife's edge. He recounted the exact words Bassett spoke to the room of trembling soldiers. First, the fate of humanity is in our hands. Second, if we follow this order, we may very well destroy the earth tonight. Third, if we refuse the order and the war has already begun, we will likely die with the rest of the world. Fourth, but if this is a mistake, and we reject a false order, we will save the entire planet. John then revealed a chilling fact about that night. According to military protocol, when the alert level is raised to DEFCON 1, any attempt to obstruct the launch of a missile is considered an act of treason. The person responsible would be treated as an enemy combatant, and every soldier in the room would be obligated to shoot them on the spot. As Bassett worked to stop the launch, tensions reached a boiling point. While he sent 2 men to neighboring crews to prevent their missiles from being fired, soldiers from those crews arrived in Bassett's room, demanding he launch his missile instead. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. In that tiny room, American soldiers pointed their guns at each other. Amidst this chaos, Bassett refused to back down. He turned his back to the barrels of his comrades' rifles and picked up the phone. His voice was firm, commanding, as though he were addressing a subordinate. You have 2 options. Either raise the alert level to DEFCON 1 or rescind the launch order. John, who stood close to the phone, remembered the tense silence that followed. When the commanding officer finally responded, his voice betrayed his fear. The order was clear. Stand down. Do not launch. As the message echoed through the room, everyone seemed to exhale for the first time in minutes. Breathing filled the silence, as if the soldiers had only just remembered how. It was October, John recalled. The weather wasn't warm, but my uniform was drenched in sweat. With the crisis averted, Bassett addressed the soldiers once more. This was a mistake, he said. We chose not to launch. We may have saved the world tonight, but there will be no medals, no recognition. This never happened. None of you are to speak of this night, ever. In the aftermath, the U.S. military conducted an inquiry into the incident. They discovered that the launch order had been transmitted in error, the result of a mistake by a major. But the fallout was almost as surreal as the events of that night. The major responsible for nearly destroying the world was punished with nothing more than a demotion in rank. Bassett, on the other hand, remained unrecognized for his heroism. When he passed away in 2011, there were no headlines, no applause for the man who had once saved humanity. It wasn't until 4 years later, in John Bordner's interview, that the world began to learn his name. After returning to the Soviet Union, Vasily Arkhipov, like the other crew members of the B-59 submarine, was greeted not as a hero, but as a pariah. Locals would point at them in public, whispering that it would have been better if they had gone down with their ship. Some even threw stones at Arkhipov's house, calling him a coward for refusing to fire. What the public didn't know, however, was a chilling truth. The B-59 carried nuclear torpedoes. Only Arkhipov, the captain, and a select few in Soviet high command were aware of this. Just like William Bassett, Arkhipov carried this secret to his grave. He never sought recognition or justification. It wasn't until 4 years after his death that his role came to light. In 2002, at a conference commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a former Soviet officer revealed the B-59's nuclear payload and Arkhipov's crucial decision to prevent its launch. At the height of the crisis, Arkhipov's calm leadership persuaded the enraged captain and crew to stand down. He didn't reveal that his refusal stemmed from the weapon's catastrophic potential. He simply kept everyone level-headed. When the story was recounted, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a historian and former advisor to President Kennedy, remarked, "Had Arkhipov agreed to launch the nuclear torpedo, there would have been no stopping a full-scale nuclear war. The U.S. and Soviet arsenals, capable of destroying the Earth hundreds of times over, would have been unleashed within hours. This is not an exaggeration. It's what I lived through." A lingering question remains. Why did Arkhipov, technically the second in command, wield such influence over the captain and political officer? The answer lies in his dual role. Arkhipov wasn't just the B-59's executive officer. He was also the commander of the entire submarine flotilla, which included 3 other vessels, B-4, B-36, and B-130. By rank, he outranked the captain by half a grade. This arrangement was no coincidence. Soviet High Command had specifically chosen Arkhipov for this mission because of his remarkable calm under pressure. This decision proved to be one of the wisest the Soviet Navy ever made. Arkhipov's reputation for keeping his cool in crisis was not unwarranted. 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, in July 1961, he had already demonstrated extraordinary courage aboard the K-19 submarine, earning him legendary status among his peers. The K-19 incident unfolded during a training exercise in the Greenland Sea. A malfunction caused the reactor's temperature to spike dangerously, threatening to trigger a meltdown. With 3 nuclear warheads on board, an explosion would have resulted in catastrophic contamination, sparking a global ecological and political crisis. Arkhipov organized a 7-man repair team, who bravely entered the radioactive reactor compartment to fix the malfunction. Though the repairs were successful, the consequences were tragic. 4 of the 7 died within hours, while the remaining 3 succumbed within a week due to acute radiation exposure. Arkhipov and the rest of the crew also suffered from radiation poisoning, leaving lasting scars on their health. In 1986, the world faced another nuclear catastrophe, the Chernobyl disaster. By then, Arkhipov was 60 years old, yet he was once again called upon to lead a crisis response team. His leadership helped stabilize the situation and minimize further fallout. However, the radiation he was exposed to during his career, including Chernobyl, took a heavy toll on his health. Vasily Arkhipov passed away in 1998 at the age of 72, enduring years of illness caused by radiation exposure. Reflecting on his life, it becomes clear that Arkhipov didn't just save the world once, but 3 times. Thanks to people like Arkhipov and Bassett, we are still here, with a chance to create a better future.